Ella.
I shall unmute myself.
We'll give people a few more minutes to log in and we'll get started. Lisa or Yaneli, do you want to share the RFA, or I can do it from my screen if you don't have it up? Thanks, Lisa. Maybe we can make it a little smaller and then scroll down to the full timeline. Yeah, that's pretty good right there. So we'll just wait a few more minutes, a couple more minutes, and let people log in.
So there is a question in the chat already about whether applicants have access to this document. So the document was indeed emailed out already, but I guess we could also email to everybody who requested.
Yeah, and I also think it should be posted on the website, although Lisa, is it on the CTSI website?
Yes, it is. I'm going to post the link in the chat as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we'll start with introductions, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation and the Q&A. My name is Mitch Wong. I am the director of the KL2 program. I'm an internist and professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine and Health Services Research. This is our 9th year of the KL2 program and our CTSI. And I'll hand it over to Ella. You can introduce yourself, Ella.
I'm Elisabetta Nemeth. I go by Ella. I am a professor in the Department of Medicine, and I do basic research related to iron homeostasis. So I'm a PhD. And I have been involved with this program for 1 year.
And Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Chan. I'm the administrator for the KL2 program, and you guys can always contact me if you have any questions after this Q&A session.
And Yaneli?
She was having internet issues, so she might have gotten kicked off.
Okay, I'll introduce Yaneli. Yaneli Arvelo is our other administrator for the program and does a lot of the organization for our program. And I will take a moment to thank Lisa and Yaneli for all the hard work that they do in the program. A lot of you will end up, if you apply for our program, you'll interact with one or both of them. And certainly if you've participated in any of our other programming, like our workshops, you may have seen their names or even met them. So I'm going to introduce the RFA for this year. And we're doing this a little differently because the program the RFA has changed a little bit. And I just wanted to make sure that the community of researchers and faculty who are applying for this announcement are aware of the changes. It's not a long presentation, it'll be pretty short. I really want to leave most of the time for questions and answers. So, and if people have questions, please type it in the chat so that we can respond to your questions. And I will say up front, if I make any incorrect statements, Lisa, Ella, you please interrupt me. So again, this is something like our 9th or 10th year for the KL2 program. And the RFA has changed a little bit over the time, but this is probably one of our biggest changes. And so that's why we're going through it here on a Zoom meeting. And to start out with, the biggest change is really a pre-application, which we started a couple of years ago, but this is the first year where our pre-application is required. And just to go over the specifics and details about that, it's a short pre-application, and the due date is early, so it's due October 15th. The reason for this pre-application is to do a couple of things. One is that I think a lot of individuals want to apply for the KL2 program. We want to encourage more people to apply, for sure. There are some times where individuals are really ineligible for the program, and so we often find out after people have written an entire application that they're not eligible for the program. So as always, you should contact us if you're not sure whether you're eligible or not. You should be contacting us now to determine whether you're eligible. But certainly with a shorter application, we'll be able to make sure that the people who are applying are eligible. But it also gives us an opportunity for the applications to be reviewed by the KL2 directors. And what we will do is for every application, we will provide you feedback, whether or not you're invited for the full application that's due in February. But by giving everybody feedback on their initial pre-application, we can help individuals improve their grant. And when the final application is due, hopefully that will help you in putting a more polished application together. So in short, the pre-application is due October 15th. It's roughly 3 pages. I think if we scroll down a little bit, we can show you the requirements for the pre-application. We really wanted to make it a little bit easier for all of you to submit this. So if you look at the middle of your screen, you'll see the components are your CV, the NIH formatted biosketch for your primary mentor, a mentor's letter, and just a 1-page specific aims page. There's 2 more pieces there listed, the rationale and approach. That's a 1-pager. It's really not meant to be highly detailed, but it's meant to really just give us a flavor for your methods for the project. And then the last piece is a 1-page statement of your candidate statement and an overview of your career development plan. Each of these components are parts of the full application, or what would be a typical K award or career development award application. But except for the specific aims page, it's a bit shortened. The pre-application is again due October 15th and will be reviewed by all the KL2 directors and co-directors. And then our plan is to provide you feedback and requests for full applications and we'll provide that request November. The date I think is November 27th. Is that right, Lisa? November 13th, sorry, November 13th. We will then, for a subset of those who submit a pre-application, we'll be requesting a full application, and that full application will be due February 26th. And then I think if anybody's familiar with what we've done in the past or familiar with a K08 or a K23 application, it's very, very similar in terms of what we expect for the full application. Specific aims page, 12 pages for the program for your full application, and then all the other components, including, of course, your bio sketch and letters of support and a mentor's letter. The rest of the details of the KL2 program are very, very similar to years past. We can go over it briefly, but again, open it up for questions. But similar to years past, this is typically a 3-year application and support. And the one thing I will note here that people should be aware of course, is that the CTSI is an NIH grant, and we just submitted a renewal. This renewal of our CTSI grant, we'll know sometime this spring whether we are renewed. Whether or not we're renewed, we will be awarding at least 1 year for this KL2 application, and assuming we get renewed, the following years will be funded for years 2 and 3 of support, and that's described here on the screen. I think the other things to note, of course, are what's listed here in the budget. The KL2 application, the grant requires that you spend 75% effort on the KL2 grant. There is an exception to the 75% effort, and that's if you're in a specialty, like for example, surgery or other procedural specialties, you can request ahead of time a reduction of that effort to 50%. There's an additional line item, of course, for benefits, as well as research expenses, tuition and career development support, and statistical support. And then up to $2,000 for travel to scientific conferences, assuming there is travel to scientific conferences then, and for a total of $130,000. I should also make you aware that the KL2 program has long been a program where we fund individuals through the NCATS funded CTSI grant, but we most years fund additional individuals through institutionally funded KL2 awards. So typically we'll have around 3 slots per year, but often we would give another 3 to 5 slots that are coming from funds from the institution. I think that's the bulk of the announcements. I don't know if Ella or Lisa, you wanted to add anything that I missed?
I think you covered everything.
Ella, did you want to add anything else?
I actually had a question, because I don't know the answer for this, but what was the % success? How many applicants get funded, regardless whether it's this CTSI or institutional KL altogether?
That's a good question. I would say we're probably around somewhere between 15 and 20%.
Okay.
Lisa, would you say that's about right?
Yeah, it varies, but I think that's about the average.
And then there's the question about how many pre-apps will be selected for full applications.
We don't have a set number. I think first off, I think for the pre-application phase, we're primarily going to review this for eligibility. But we certainly will be reviewing the pre-applications for content and selecting the top applications for a full application. But we know that the pre-application is relatively short, and it may be somewhat difficult to distinguish the very top application. So we'll probably try to be more inclusive than exclusive. I can talk a little bit about what would typically be problematic for some applications in previous years, and these are the applications that would typically get screened out at this stage. Individuals who maybe either too early or too late for what we consider to be ideal applicants for the KL2. I think in years past, we occasionally have individuals who have some research experience, but really don't have quite enough research experience to be super competitive. There's no magic number, but certainly if you perhaps are lacking in publications, that sometimes can influence the competitiveness of an application. Again, there's no set number of publications, but that sometimes does come up. Certainly, of course, it is a strict requirement that people have a faculty appointment by the time that the grant would be started, and the grant has to start on July 1st, 2021. So if you are currently in a trainee title, like a fellowship title or a pre-doctoral title, and you will continue to be in that title past July 1st, 2021, you would not be eligible. I think the other situation does occur where people who are maybe too advanced, if you're too many years out from your terminal research degree, that can reflect on whether you're eligible or not. Again, there's no strict criteria on that. I think in the past, we have had individuals who are many years past their terminal degree, and in some cases took a turn doing clinical work and then came back to do research. So if there's concern that maybe you're too far out from your terminal degree, you should definitely want to talk to us now, and we can give you some initial impressions about that. And certainly it's probably worth justifying in your candidate statement if you think maybe you're not your typical candidate in terms of years of experience. In terms of the science itself, we will be reviewing the science itself and giving comments, and depending on how many applications, we will probably be prioritizing applications based on the quality of the applicant as well as the science that's being proposed.
Then we have a question about who reviews the full applications.
That's a great question, and I'll kind of answer that in two parts. The first part is being the pre-application, initial application. That's going to be reviewed by Dr. Namath and myself, as well as the site directors for the KL2 program at each site. All of us on that committee have a lot of experience reading K awards, and there's enough scientific expertise among all of us, I think, to give an initial review for most of the applications. But obviously, the six of us don't have full scientific expertise in all the applications that we'll get. So that's why the second stage, the full application, will be reviewed by us as well as two reviewers with expertise in the field that the application comes from. And those faculty members are generally going to be at any one of the 4 sites of our CTSI, and we will select these individuals based on their scientific expertise. Let's see here.
So further question is there a preference for MDs or MD PhDs and or for specific medical subspecialties apart from content and training plan?
Yeah, so there is no preference. In the past, we've funded MDs, we funded PhDs, and we funded MD PhDs. So you can apply with any of those degrees, and we don't really select based on that. It's really based on your accomplishments and the quality of the science. In terms of specialties, there's no set number, there's no preference. We generally don't look at the specialties in particular in making any decisions at all. We actually are looking for, the only thing I'd say that where it may come up is our goal is to identify and fund and support a diversity of individuals from different backgrounds, different research perspectives. We certainly encourage people who come from different schools. So we've funded people from public health and nursing, people who have appointments in the College of Letters and Sciences, in addition to, of course, people who have appointments in the School of Medicine. So we really do try to look broadly, and our ultimate goal over all of our applications and over all of our grantees, we try to get that diversity in there. So we don't have any set numbers. And I think a related question might be translational research. I think this comes up occasionally. People think that their research has to be translational, which technically, you know, it is true. Your research needs to be translational, but we think of the perspective of funding translational research among our grantees. We have some people who are doing very basic science research, sort of more on the T1 spectrum, and we have other people who are doing T4 research. And so as a whole, our grantees cover the spectrum from T1 to T4 science. We don't expect each application to be translational from T1 to T4 by itself. And so I think if you're doing research here at UCLA, that's going to be probably make you eligible right there.
There's a question about the eligibility, about how getting KL2 affects number of years for future K applications.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky question, and it's come up in the past and it's changed over time. So technically there are some rules at NIH about how many years you can be supported on a K award. But because the KL2 program came in existence, that number has changed a little bit, and it differs from institute to institute. So I think typically what we've seen is that the total number of years of support, you can add that up, but you have to ask your program officer how that might affect you. A common situation is that people apply for the KL2 program and we fund them. And then after the KL2 program, they switch to their individual K award. And in most circumstances, the KL2 doesn't affect how many years of support they can get on a K08 or K23. So theoretically, you could even get maybe as many as 8 years of support. You could do 3 years on a KL2 and an additional 5 years on a K08, K23. That would be probably the maximum. But again, each institute has put out, or I wouldn't say each institute, some of the institutes have put out specific announcements about that and have limited it in a specified way, and it does vary. There other possibility is that you might go from a KL2 to a K12. That's possible, and people have done that, or they go from a K12 to a KL2, and that's possible as well. I think if you generally think of probably not exceeding more than 5 years of support total between the K12 and the KL2, that's certainly safe. If you've already received 3 years of K12 support, we would have to check in and determine whether we could limit you, whether we would be required to limit you to 2 or 3 years. I don't know, Lisa, if you know the answer to that.
I think because the K12 to KL2 and vice versa, they're considered a lateral move. So I think it's capped at 5 years total, and that may or may not affect subsequent individual K funding depending on the institute.
Yeah. I will say that the majority of institutes haven't really specified one way or the other what they'll do. Just I think 3 or 4 of them that I know of, like NHLBI has made an announcement, but generally speaking, they've tried to be more encouraging of people to apply for the KL2 and switch to a K08, K23, or K01, and they have not put a strict limit on 5 years of support. For the other institutes that haven't made a specific announcement, they've been very generous, and they've generally had not limited individuals to a total of 5 years of support. They generally have allowed people to apply for a full 5 years of support, even if they've already had time on a KL2.
There is a question here whether this KL2 proposal is strictly for clinical research or also open to basic science work focused on a clinical medical disease disorder?
Yeah, that's a good question. It relates to what I had mentioned before. I think you can definitely be doing basic science research and be eligible for this grant. I think if you're doing very, very basic science research, it probably makes sense to indicate in your application how this translates to human disease eventually. But obviously, a lot of basic science research doesn't have direct clinical applications, and that's okay. But it probably would be helpful to connect the dots a little bit in that.
So another question is, if we are at one of the 4 partners institutions as a postdoc and are planning to go to another partner institution next July, should we get a mentor from each site or go with a future mentor at the future plan site?
Yeah, it probably is worth talking a little bit more directly to you to understand your situation. I would certainly say that having a mentor at your future site would make a lot of sense, since they will be at your site, and having that mentor near you can be extremely helpful. But on the other hand, you can make an argument. You should always go for the best mentor possible. And I think if that best mentor is within the 4 institutions, but not at your own institution, that could be okay too, as long as you can make an argument for why that is, why that's the best mentor, and make it clear how you'll connect.
How about having co-mentors? I think that would be fine.
Yes, I thought that's a good point too. And certainly you can make an argument for co-mentoring. So.
Another question is to explain why people can't apply for KL2 if they're also submitting a K award in January to March cycle.
Yes, thank you for that question. And again, Lisa, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this rule is actually dictated by NCATS, which is our NIH funder for the CTSI and the KL2 program. So they made it very specific, and this would be kind of true at NIH. You can't take an application and submit it to 2 different agencies, for example, and have it reviewed by 2 different study sections at the same time. Similarly, they see the CTSI KL2 program as an extension of the NIH. And so you couldn't have an application reviewed at the NIH and our KL2 program at the same time. Now, that being said, we don't consider the full application until February. This pre-application is just a pre-application. So the full application is due February. So the only cycle that would prevent you from submitting to NIH would be the January to March 2021 cycle. I think it comes up where people say, well, what about if I submit my grant for the September, October 2020 cycle? Generally, that's not an issue for us because that's the prior cycle. And of course, by the time we get your full application, you will have a score, and you'll have a sense of whether that grant is in the fundable range or not. If you're not in the fundable range, we will review your application. If your grant is in the fundable range, we will still review your application. And then depending on whether your NIH individual K award gets funded, we'll decide later that spring whether or not we will fund you if that is an issue. I know that gets a little complicated. So if you think you're applying for the September cycle, October cycle, and you have detailed questions of exactly how that would work, you should just let us know. But in general, it would be fine. You just need to let us know that you did that, and you need to let us know what your score is once you get it, which is typically you're going to know by February or so.
There's an extension of this question. So somebody submitted in June, so they may resubmit their K23 in March, and whether this resubmission would make them ineligible for KL2.
Yeah, the resubmission would make you ineligible. Yeah. There are a couple ways to strategize about that, and I don't, you might talk to your mentor about what would be the best strategy. I think one option would be to delay your resubmission by just one cycle. And whether that's the best thing for you or not, I leave that up to you. But from our perspective, you know, if you submit to us, it gives you an opportunity to have your grant reviewed by our senior faculty and get additional comments, and that would help you polish your grant further. Obviously, with the resubmission, you already have comments from a study section, so that may or may not be critical to you. But our turnaround time is ideally, hopefully, pretty quick, so that if you do submit if you have a full application and you submit it in February, you'll know within about 3 months whether we're more or less whether we're going to be able to fund you locally. And you can still submit for the June, no matter whether we fund you or not. You could still submit that resubmission for what would be basically June, July cycle.
I guess the good part about KL2 is that the full application is due in February and the funding starts in July. So the distance between submission and the start of funding is much shorter, whereas NIH takes much longer.
Yeah, that's right. While we wait for any other comments that you might have, let me also just make a couple other suggestions. One other suggestion, and you may or may not be aware that we have a K Scholar Society. The K Scholar Society is a career development training program for faculty who have a K award at UCLA or one of our partnered sites. In that seminar series, we meet monthly, and we cover a wide range of topics that I think are relevant to most junior faculty in research series. Grant writing, negotiating, team science, leadership training,
Budgeting,
project management, mentoring, a whole host of things. So for anybody at UCLA or the partner sites who have a K award or an equivalent career development award, we welcome you to the K Scholar Society, and you should let us know if you're interested. For those of you, obviously, you're on this call, you're interested in applying for a K, so you probably don't already have a K. I highly recommend that you include the K Scholar Society in your educational plan. We're going to assume you're in the K Scholar Society if you become a KL2 scholar, but certainly if any of you end up getting your own K award or a different type of career development award, say from a foundation, I think adding the K Scholar Society to your education plan is a plus, and it's worth adding to your application.
so there's one about the specific timing. If somebody gets KL2 from UCLA on July 1st, submits NIHK in June and gets it on the first shot, how does that funding transition work?
So we have probably a pretty large number of our scholars do exactly what you're saying here. They'll submit their K award in June, basically a month before they get the KL2, or soon after that, perhaps the September-October cycle. Regardless of when if you do get lucky and you get your NIHK funded, that transition just happens whenever the K award is funded. And that can vary. So sometimes people, I think probably the earliest you might get funded is 9 months after the submission, more or less, give or take. But sometimes people don't get funded for well over a year, and that can be influenced by the institute and the cycle. So whenever you get your notice of award from the NIH for your K award, you switch over. So there's usually pretty much a seamless transition from KL2 to individual K. Lisa just posted the link to the website for the CTSI K Scholar Society. And so there's there are great details there about what that looks like, and you can plug a lot of the content there directly into your grant. Please don't feel the need to do that for your KL2 application, because we know about the program and we will assume that you're going to be in it. But that link is mainly there if you're going to perhaps submit an individual K08, K8, K23, K01 application. Another question came in about the elements of a good education or training plan. I've talked a lot. Ella, you want to take this one?
No, please go ahead. You have so much experience with it.
You know, I think for most people writing a K award these days, people have already a lot of experience in research by the time they become competitive and eligible for a K award. And so I think a lot of young faculty struggle with what's a good education plan, given that they already have a lot of training. And I think that's the challenge. I think a good education plan starts with a description of who you are and the training that you've had and the experience that you've had. And of course, generally people want to talk very positively about their skill set and what they've accomplished. But at the same time, you do have to carve out what it is that's new about your career going forward that you're going to learn that will help you become independent. And so I think you want to make a clear line about what are the things that you have accomplished, and then indicate what are the new skill sets or content area that will be part of your proposed K award. As a rule of thumb, I do recommend, if you kind of think about all the things that you maybe still need to learn, generally, I think most people propose around 3 aims for their educational plan. And those 3 educational objectives can be a mixture of content as well as methods. And I usually recommend mixing content and methods. It could be 3 methods, but I think most typically we see people propose 3 objectives, and it's usually a mixture of content and methods. I think the other thing I would make sure about your educational plan is that it's tied with the it's tied to the research objectives. Occasionally people have 3 research objectives, and then they have some educational aims, educational objectives, and there's no connection between the 2. So there should be an obvious connection to between the specific aims of your research and the educational objectives. Occasionally, people will have an educational objective that's related to the next phase of the career after the Career Development Award. For example, maybe you're developing a potential new treatment, and that's part of your K award. The next step would be testing that new treatment in a clinical trial. And so in that case, the person may put in their educational objectives to get clinical trials training. That's perfectly fine. You just want to make that link for the reviewers so that it's clear to them that even though you're getting clinical trials training and there's no clinical trials in your K award, that this would be the next step. And I think the last piece of what I think probably is an important part of a good educational plan, training plan, is to make sure you have an expert and a mentor for each of your educational objectives. And as a rule of thumb, you should have one and only one mentor expert for each of your objectives. Sometimes people will say, well, my objective is A, and I have 2 people who are going to help me with this. If you have 2 people teaching you that objective, you really want to make sure why that you need 2. Each mentor should have a unique role and a rationale for being on the grant. And so if you have 2 people who look very similar in terms of experience, in terms of their ability to teach you, then you want to make it clear, why do you need 2 people? Maybe 1 would do. So I think that's another issue. It's okay to have a mentor cover 2 different objectives, but you shouldn't have 2 mentors covering 1 objective.
I think also, at least based on NIHK awards, it is important to have something related to ethics, how you are going to engage in different ethics classes related to human or animal research.
Yes, that's a required element. It's certainly a required element for an NIHK 08 K23, and we do put that in our full application. You don't need to put it in for the short pre-application, but that is definitely one of the required elements for the full application.
And also from what I've seen from NHK applications, it is good to highlight how you are going to interact with the scientific community, which specific meetings you're going to go to. So make it pretty specific, which meetings and what you're gaining from them and how you're going to establish your network toward independence.
Yeah. I think that the harder part will be the pre-application, because people will wonder, what do I put in there? As a rule of thumb, I think if you leave about a half a page to describe you as a candidate, which would include some of your accomplishments and your experiences and your training, I think that leaves you about a half a page for your educational plan. Obviously, with a half a page for your educational plan, you don't have the room to include all of these elements that you're seeing on the screen, which are part of the full application. Really, I think probably with the half a page that you're going to have for the pre-application, it's probably just a description of the 3 educational objectives, why you need that training, and how does it fit with the science, and probably a mention of who your mentor is going to be for that particular educational objective. Let's see, one more question here. Something about, let's see, would it be more desirable or more likely for the KL2 to be funded if one were to do a mini version of the K23? Yeah, I think thinking about how does a K23 and a KL2 relate to each other, and obviously K23s are typically 5-year grants and the KL2 is only 3 years. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think anytime you have a grant and you submit it, whether it's a KL2 or K23, what you propose has to look feasible. If you have a really ambitious project and the reviewer is looking at this application and thinking, how is it possible that they're going to be able to accomplish everything in 3 years? Then that's going to raise some flags. So I think it depends on the application, and your mentor should be giving you advice about this. I think sometimes people will take maybe one of the aims and drop it. I think sometimes people just put the whole thing in there and they'll say they'll do it in 3 years. So it's a little bit of a difficult question to answer, and probably is worth a deeper conversation with your mentor. I think in general, what people tend to do is they tend to propose, they tend to be a little bit over ambitious in what they propose. Because if you're going to hedge on one side or the other, I think people tend to hedge on being overly ambitious as opposed to under ambitious. And as a rule of thumb, I think that's a good strategy. Ella, you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to say, like, as one of the examples, let's say that you make it very similar to K23, but just reduce, as you suggested here, number of participants or something like that. You have to be concerned about the power that you have. So if you're changing your application so that it doesn't give you quite the answer in as powerful manner, that's probably not a good way to go. Then rather than that, I would just take one aim of the whole project or 2 aims rather than make it less powerful of an approach.
Yeah.
An example of the content part of the training plan as opposed to the methods part.
Yeah. You don't need to have a content, but I think sometimes people, you have to look at, you need to look at your CV and your biosketch and look at your publications and decide whether there are aspects of what you've published and what you've done so far compared to what you're proposing. So, you know, certainly if you're studying a new disease process or a new disease or a new population, it very well would be appropriate to add that content area to your educational objectives.
It could be an actual. It could be an actual class at UCLA or seminar. Let's say something in bioinformatics. If you want to study bioinformatics, you could take a formal class or formal class in hematology, or content part could be formal classes.
Yeah.
At UCLA.
Yeah. One example would be, you know, you've done some work in immunology, but you really have very little training in T cell function, that would be a content area. I think sometimes, like on health services research, people may not necessarily understand like health disparities, and so they might make health disparities a content area. And sometimes there's coursework that's relevant. Sometimes there isn't coursework irrelevant, and so people will put in like a tutorial or a workshop of some sort. But I think the question is really more about like content-wise. I think it's really meant like if there's a new field, an extension of a different field that you haven't studied before, you could propose that. Next question is really about workshops or courses remotely. I think I'll comment what I mean for the KL2 program, and that's different than I think what NIH study sections will say. And I'm much more practical than NIH study sections, so I'll have to answer this two parts. From my perspective in the KL2 program, and I think I speak on behalf of the directors because we reviewed a lot of grants, we're very practical, and we try to not make you say you're going to do things that aren't reasonable or practical. So whatever it takes for you to learn a content or a topic or a method is appropriate. And we leave it to you to decide what that is, as long as it seems reasonable. So a workshop could be fine. A formal course could be fine. I think a tutorial, a one-on-one tutorial with your mentor is fine. Honestly, we know that for courses, like formal credit courses on campus, that can be very time consuming. And we know, I'll be honest, don't quote me, but we know that a lot of our scholars don't take those courses that they say they'll take. My personal opinion is that is fine. We really do want you to learn new things and make that part of your grant. And so again, I think you should put in for the KL2 application whatever is actually realistic and feasible and helpful to you. That's a very different answer than I would give if you're taking the grant and you're applying for NIHK, because we've seen people at NIH, the reviewers, study sections who read K awards, there's just a huge diversity of opinion. And there's no one right formula, except for the fact that you probably need some courses and you need some other methods of learning. If you have, for example, 3 educational objectives and you propose 15 courses, that's not going to work. It wouldn't work for the KL2 program, and it certainly wouldn't work at NIH, because we know that 15 courses is way too much. You're just never going to do it. Even if those courses are remote, which is part of the discussion. If you only propose 1 course or 0 courses, and we've seen people do that, that's generally not a good idea either. It might get by, but if you have 0 courses or only 1 or 2 courses proposed in your educational plan at NIH, there will be reviewers who say that's not detailed or rigorous enough. So there's no magic number for how many courses, but you probably should have a few. I think typically we see people propose, it depends on whether you're basic science or outside of basic science, like doing clinical research, but it can be as few as 3, maybe as many as 5 or 6.
I think one per year would be, let's say for 1 per year, a class would be sufficient.
Yeah, and 1 per year for sure. And obviously maybe in your 5th year, you don't need a course, because the timing of your courses has to match the science. And so maybe 1 per year for the first 4 years is a reasonable ballpark number. Yeah. In terms of remote, yes, remote courses are fine. I think in the past, people might've been a little more skeptical, but nowadays with COVID, I think we readily accept that in-person courses is not even feasible. And I think people are much more accepting of remote courses, so that would be fine. Let's see. This is a question about changes in protocol given COVID. Yeah, I do think pretty much any reviewer is going to look at your application and look at feasibility. I think COVID is a really big unknown. And I think from the perspective of a study section, they're going to want to know, can you do the project given the challenges of doing things in person? So it's probably worthwhile addressing in your application, both for the KL2 program or if you apply for NHK. Are there differences in the review process or considerations related to COVID effects? I would say certainly in terms of feasibility, but in terms of preliminary data, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get any different evaluation because of COVID. You could imagine people might be might give you a pass if you haven't been that productive in terms of publications in the last year, because I think everybody's seen or experienced a slowdown in their productivity as a result. So I think one area where this could affect it is if you have fewer publications in the last year. I don't know of any other specific things I can say about that. Ella, would you add anything to that?
Difficult to say. I mean, I totally expect people to have fewer preliminary data, but I also think that will partially, how that will be evaluated will partially depend on the competition. At least I can say that from the NIH study section perspective. If there are some people who did generate a lot of preliminary data, that they will look a little bit better than the ones who didn't generate any.
Yeah, I mean,
unfortunately. But I think there will be some consideration, and I expect that most people will have an issue with preliminary data, having a lot of preliminary data.
I mean, anybody who applies is going to be in the same boat. So I do think that reviewers compare applications for sure. So I suspect it probably won't. It'll kind of pan out and be an even playing field, I guess, from the perspective of the reviewer. I will say that there is also a separate question, which whether is preliminary data required. Technically speaking, for a K award, you don't need preliminary data. But feasibility is an issue. So if you have any preliminary data or text that describes the feasibility of your project or the likelihood of success, you should include it.
I guess that all of the prior publications, if the K application or KL2 application is building on the previous publications, that those previous publications are sort of preliminary data because you're building on something and indicating, it suggests the feasibility of the project and what is it based on.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes that data comes from your mentor or your collaborators, not necessarily only from the work that you personally did as an applicant. So just so everybody hears this, Lisa made a note, workshops and remote courses can be budgeted in your KL2 budget. That would be in the educational line item. So if you know specifically that you're going to take a course or a workshop that costs money, you can put that in there. Let's see. I'm seeing there to be an excessive weight on manuscripts and review according to COVID. Yes, I think that's very true. It is a good point. I think everybody's going to be in the same boat. But certainly if you have manuscripts that are submitted and you put that in review, I think that gets looked at. It's different than a manuscript that's in preparation. So if the manuscript is submitted and under review, yeah, I think you should definitely indicate that. And I think the study section will take that into account. And by study section, I mean NIH or the KL2 directors. So obviously you don't have any control over that other than you can, I mean, you only have some control over that. You can submit it and definitely recommend you do that. Posters and podiums. This is a really important topic that I think I'm glad it was raised and I think it's worth talking about. in bio sketches and on your CV, it's perfectly fine to put in presentations and posters and podium talks on your CV. For a bio sketch, I think you have to be a little more careful. And most importantly, it's important not to put in projects that make it unclear whether it's a published paper or whether it's an abstract at a meeting. And I think we see this pretty commonly where people list a bunch of items on their bio sketch, and it's without looking at PubMed, we can't tell whether it's a poster, abstract, or whether it's a peer-reviewed publication. In general, for most people, I recommend in your bio sketch that you only include peer-reviewed publications that have been published or are in press. If you have something that you really feel is important to put on there and you want to put under review, you can do that, but just make sure it's clear. If you do feel compelled to include an abstract or a poster or a podium presentation, you need to make sure that it is absolutely 100% crystal clear that that's the case. So usually in parentheses afterwards, you should say abstract or podium presentation. If you have enough publications, I recommend you really should just not include those items in your bio sketch. A CV is a different situation because on the CV you have different sections that allow that. So on your CV you can include that, just make sure it's all in the right location. Ella, would you agree with that?
Yes, I was just going to say, I'm thinking, let's say if that particular presentation at a meeting was selected for best of, oral presentations, or we've had examples where one of our students or postdocs had their presentation at American Society of Hematology selected for best of ASH to be highlighted there. That actually may be a worthwhile thing to point out. Although that could go into honors as well.
Yes, yeah, that's what I would have suggested, is that it goes in the honors award section. Let's see here. NIH instructions for the biosketch state: if you wish to explain factors that affected your past productivity, such as family care responsibilities, illness, you may address them in the personal statement. Absolutely, I think that's always true. I think it's perfectly appropriate to point that out, and including mentioning COVID. And again, you can do this in your candidate statement as well. My actual recommendation for, if you're submitting for a K award, I actually think the best place to put that is actually your mentor's letter. A mentor has more of a perspective and has the experience to describe what they consider to be adequate productivity. And I think when it comes from the candidate, it can sound a little defensive, like, well, I didn't publish this because this got in the way, or I had this issue from a family. And I think those are that you can definitely state that. But I think when the mentor says it, there's a different way in which it can be expressed that doesn't sound defensive, but can actually be well justified. So that would be another place to indicate sort of personal or other issues that come up that affect productivity. Just a couple more minutes if any other questions come in. Let's see. Thank you, Lisa. Lisa mentioned that there's a recording of the session. I would recommend that feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Sometimes people have questions that are really more specific to them and their application. If we can answer the question, we will definitely answer it. Sometimes people ask questions and we can't answer it, like, can you review our pre-application and tell me if it's good? We can't answer those kinds of questions, but if you have logistic questions or other things about eligibility or any of the process, please feel free to reach out to me directly, to Lisa. We answer a lot of questions and we're happy to talk to you offline after the meeting by email or phone. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Please spread the word, even though that's our competition, but I highly encourage everyone to apply. We'd love to see as many of your applications as possible. We think this is, whether you get funded or not, we see this as a process to help you. And thank you, Ella and Lisa and Yaneli and everybody else on the phone.
Thank you, Mitch. Great as always. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.